Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts and the trustees of the National Gallery of Art, I want to welcome you all to the second Wyeth Lecture in American Art. As many of you here know, a generous grant from the Wyeth Foundation for American Art makes it possible for us to bring every other year a distinguished lecturer in the field, with a conference for younger scholars in the intervening years. Our inaugural speaker 2 years ago was Jules Prown of Yale University, who has played such an important role in the lives of many scholars in the field, many of whom I'm happy to see are here today. Among the most distinguished of these is Kathleen Foster. When we were thinking about our second lecturer, the choice of Dr. Foster was obvious to everyone, and we're delighted that she accepted our invitation. Kathleen Foster is the Robert L. McNeill Jr. Curator of American Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where she also directs the Center for American Art. She received her BA from Wellesley College and her MA, MPhil, and PhD degrees from Yale. Even before receiving the PhD, she embarked on a curatorial career in American art at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, beginning as assistant curator in 1979 and advancing to the joint responsibilities of chief curator and director of research and publications. From there, she moved to Indiana, serving as curator of 19th and 20th century art at the University Art Museum before returning to Philadelphia in 2002. Kathleen Foster's many awards and long list of publications appear in a highly condensed form on the lecture announcement, and here I will only single out her Whitney Fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum, Visiting Fellowship at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, and 3 fellowships or grants from the NEH, 5 from the NEA, by my count anyway. In this context, it's a pleasure to note that she also held a fellowship from the Wyeth Foundation in 1974-75. So today's event is something of a 30th anniversary, a return on that early investment. Her book, Thomas Eakins Rediscovered, received a Getty Publication grant and subsequently won the Eric Mitchell Prize in Art History for an excellent first book. Dr. Foster has also written on, among others, Thomas Hart Benton, Daniel Garber, American Watercolors, John Lafarge, and the American Pre-Raphaelites. Kathleen Foster's most recent work has brought her back to the name of Wyeth. For the exhibition of Andrew Wyeth, Memory and Magic, opening very soon in Atlanta, and then moving to Philadelphia, she's written an essay on meaning and medium in the art of Andrew Wyeth. Indeed, Kathleen Foster has mastered the art of bringing the Brandywine and the Schuylkill together, and today we're delighted to introduce the Potomac into the mix. Eakins is much in our minds at the National Gallery after John Wilmerding's gracious gift of his portrait of Dr. Thompson, and it's with very great pleasure that I introduce our Wyeth lecturer's talk today on Eakins and the Grand Manner portrait. Kathleen, thank you.
That has to have been the nicest introduction I have ever had. It was a work of art. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to have some pictures up here, and it's really the Thompson portrait that was the inspiration for this talk. I was so happy to see it. I'm sorry not to see John Wilmerding here, but his presence will be heard throughout. And it was thinking about the Thompson portrait, and I came down this summer to work with Nancy Anderson and Michael Swicklick to think about that portrait that helped me confect tonight's talk, in addition to a totally serendipitous encounter with the National Gallery of Art's website. This spring, when I was also thinking about this talk, I found myself on a page that was about British and American Grand Manner portraits at the National Gallery. And I don't know, maybe Frank Kelly had something to do with this, but it was a great little summary of what the Grand Manner portrait tradition was. And I thought, well, that would be a lovely way to frame the arrival of the Thompson portrait and to talk about Eakins in the tradition of the Grand Manner portrait. So that's what's happening today. And what is a Grand Manner portrait? Well, I'm going to let you all go home and call up the website and find out what the National Gallery says about it. But basically, in a nutshell, the Grand Manner portrait tradition is literally about being grand, that is, being big, being life-sized, a big canvas with a big impact. Both for the artist and for the sitter. There's going to be a lot of effort and a lot of expense in a Grand Manner portrait. It's also usually grand in program, with a lot of agendas running, usually about the importance of the sitter, who is almost always powerful, well-born, and very wealthy, wealthy enough to afford a painter who can make a picture this big and this grand. In a Grand Manner portrait, you're going to find clues to rank, usually in costume, in properties, or in the background, and often some kind of a symbolic or allegorical reference. So I'm beginning with two familiar folks for you. We've got Louis XIV on the left and George Washington on the right. Both of them classic instances of what I mean by a Grand Manner portrait, and I think the National Gallery is packed with them. Gainsborough, Reynolds, Van Dyck, the like, full-length portraits with symbols of rank, like, for example, Louis XIV's fleur-de-lis, which represent the Kingdom of France, or the rhetorical gesture of George Washington, which conjures up literally millennia of the language of oratory from Roman sculpture. Many of these gestures and symbols, the curtain swag, the column, becoming so repeated as to be cliched, a part of what we now recognize as the conventions of the Grand Manner. Well, at the very least, this kind of a portrait is highly respectful. It is dignified. The sitter is made usually to look very good. And the basis of a portrait always is a likeness, but a Grand Manner portrait usually can veer off of the accuracy of likeness in favor of the iconic qualities of the sitter having to do with their role. So that while the artist's job is to be complementary, there are these other agendas running. The artist is in service to the sitter and to also a program of power about the importance of the sitter. Well, I have a second program here for today, and that has to do also with the self-portrait, and I'm going to be talking about these two issues simultaneously. What can we learn about an artist from their own representation? Generally, an artist's self-portrait is not going to be in the Grand Manner format. It's not going to be as gigantic. It's not going to be as complex in its iconographical program. It's nonetheless about self-representation. Here is Thomas Eakins on your left. There's a gent on your right I hope you recognize from your own galleries here. Vincent, in 1889, and of course it's always fun to think about the two of these guys occupying the earth at about the same time, very close contemporaries. The thing about an artist's self-portrait is often the intensity of our encounter with that person, because of course the artist is his own best model. Patient, ever ready, constantly interested. And many artists paint many self-portraits because they find themselves always available, and maybe perhaps because there are not other paying sitters out there. But time and again, an artist is at his or her best in a self-portrait. Sometimes a self-portrait brings things out of a painter that are buried in more routine work, and it has to do partly with that patience, perhaps with some of that vanity, but in any event, the self-portrait is always an interesting place to meet an artist. And it's a kind of program here to think about the ways that we can read about an artist from their self-portrait. What exactly can we learn? How much can we trust Eakins? How much can we trust Van Gogh in their self-representation? Van Gogh we look at and we can see, even if we didn't know a lot about him, the intensity of his personality, the instability of his personality, perhaps guessing the neediness of him. In Aikens, we look at him, he seems sad, he seems wise, he seems a little bit beaten up, he seems perhaps a bit reproaching. We can start reading into this. One question is, do we like these people? Do we like them as we see them in their self-portrait? Is that important? Another question is, how much can we really learn about them from the self-portrait? Is it really reliable when we start making up things about their personality and their life story? Is that fair? Well, a subtext also in my talk today is going to be about the power of the face-to-face encounter, about how different a portrait is when the sitter looks at you than when they look away. And so that feeling of connection and of scrutiny that you get in both of these self-portraits is also going to be something that I'm going to touch on as we go through the slides. But the main point here is that Van Gogh's self-portrait reminds us of the artist's manipulation of his subject. That is, it's very obviously, expressively colored, the texture is strong, it has been manipulated as it's presented to us. Aikens, we get tricked by the trope of realism into thinking that this is Aikens standing behind the glass looking at us. And one of the things I want to do is enliven our awareness here of what Linda Nochlin called the realist fallacy. That is, that we get lulled into a sense of it all being exactly like that, when in fact realism is full of its own conventions, its own choices, its own manipulations, and that Aikens is in fact doing some of the same things to us that Vincent is. And indeed, he is projecting himself in his painting as a message, as a confection, in very many of the same ways that Vincent van Gogh is doing. So in some ways, maybe because of the issue here of subjectivity, of a face that you've looked at so much, of a will to project yourself in a certain way, maybe a self-portrait is the worst place to start in looking at an artist, in trying to get to know them. And so we have to ask right off the bat, is there perhaps a mask here? Is there a pretense that we should be warned about? Well, we can look at Aikens in many photographs too. Aikens here in the shed at the University of Pennsylvania in 1885 with a woman model, both of them nude, and Aikens in his studio in 1892. Aikens is one of the most photographed artists in his period that I have ever encountered, and that is a very tempting document. And we, of course, look to photography as being a very straightforward document of what's happening. Well, of course, here I am to tell you that there is a fallacy of the photographic truth as well. And any of us have meddled with Photoshop now know how, of course, the photography can be manipulated as well. But even so, a photograph from the early days of photography here in the 1880s can still manipulate the truth and present it to us in a way that is hugely incomplete. What can we know about Aikens from photographs of him? Well, from these photographs, we can learn a lot about the context of his work, more than we could from his self-portrait. We can look at him in his studio on the right, look at the kind of clothes he's wearing, his grooming, his informal posture with his hand in pocket. This is still a moment of the formality of the photograph. Conventional portrait photographs are usually quite contrived. And to have yourself seen here looking kind of rumpled, posed in this informal fashion with all of the clutter of the studio, that tells you a lot about Aikens, the way in which he wanted to be presented to you, to history, to his own contemporaries. We can also see from both of these pictures that he was a well-built man, an athlete, basically a very healthy, middle-class Irish guy, very comfortable without his clothes off, which is also very unusual in the 1880s, which I have to say was one of the most prudish decades of world history. And this willingness to doff his clothes, and I have to say that I knew when I was studying the photographs at the Bregler collection that I'd been looking at these pictures too long when I recognized Akins in this picture when his head was turned. There are that many pictures of him in the nude in the Bregler collection. Anyway, this is a very unconventional guy, and perhaps with an exhibitionistic streak that was going to get him into a lot of trouble, and it did. This man was out there testing the edges of society. Insofar as we can learn these things about him from his behavior in front of the camera, from the environment of his studio, from the motion photographs that he is in the middle of taking. This is a kind of rest period between these photographs of people running and jumping that he took in the 1880s. These are still ultimately the surface of Akins, and how can we get deeper to learn more about him? Akins himself said in a little biographical squib, "My life is all in my work." He didn't want to give a lot of details about his biography. For the public, my life is all in my work. And so, in fact, I think the richest portrait of the artist is going to be found in his work, in his paintings, and in, most interestingly, his paintings of other people. Here are two of his best-known pictures. The portrait of Samuel Gross on the left from 1875, and the Champion Single Skulls, a portrait of Max Schmidt from 1871. The Gross Clinic is certainly the grandest of Akins' grand manner portraits. And so we can begin here with maybe his best known example in this genre. Right off the bat, you can see that this is an Akins grand manner version set in the modern period. It is not about aristocracy, it's about meritocracy. So we don't have kings anymore, or even presidents, but we have working people who are very good at what they do. Max Schmidt, the champion of single skulls, Samuel Gross, one of the great surgeons and teachers of the Jefferson Medical College. Well, others have very astutely noted that all of Akins' work, even if it's announcing itself to be a genre painting about rowing or sailing, wrestling, swimming, and so forth, it's all based on portraiture. Elizabeth John's great book on Thomas Akins from 1982, which I still think is one of the best books written on Akins, she characterized all of his work as being basically about portraiture, because even the little hunters off in the distance are actually people he knew who are depicted as portraits. And so all of his work is bound up in telling about the stories of others. It also, I think, reflects back to us Akins and his sense of himself, not just the friends that he knew, but also literally a portrait of himself. And in that regard, I turn to Oscar Wilde, who said in one of his famous quips that every portrait made with feeling is a portrait of the artist. That the artist will be emerging through their sitter to you. And so with that as my motif, I want to talk about what are the ways in which these portraits, especially the grand portraits, are self-portraits of the artist. Akins, of course, was literally an anatomist. He attended Jefferson Medical College dissection classes. He was a rower, so he is invisibly in these paintings because he pursued these same tasks. He admired these people for being the best at something that he himself enjoyed. But there are other ways in which Akins' portraits tell us about himself. These are two of his earliest grand portraits. Benjamin Rand on the left from 1874, and his fiancée, Catherine Crowell, from 1872. What we can see in these, as in Max Schmidt and Dr. Gross, is his determination to be modern, to be local, to be Philadelphian, to paint the people that he knew in the landscapes that he knew, to celebrate the heroes that he himself enjoyed, to bring, in effect, the grand manner tradition right down to the neighborhood in Philadelphia, right up to the minute, to make these portraits very American. And this campaign, which I think went for 3 decades throughout his career, begins in the early 70s, not long after he got back from Paris, from his 3-year study in Paris and in Europe in 1870. These are the 2 pictures that he painted before he did the painting of Dr. Gross in his clinic. Dr. Rand was his chemistry teacher in high school. He's shown here with a cat, petting a cat when with his microscope on the desk and a lot of junk around, kind of like Aiken's own studio, showing you what he's up to. And his fiancée also playing with a cat in her lap. What this tells you about Aikens and cats, I'm not going to go to today, but in any event, both of these tell you about Paris and they tell you about Spain. They tell you about his training as a realist at the École des Beaux-Arts with Gérôme and with Bonnat, and they tell you, I think very powerfully, about the impact of several months that he spent in Spain with a long visit to the Prado to soak up the lessons of the great painters of the Spanish Baroque. You see the kind of detail, the quality of light, the color of the Spanish masters, but all of it made modern, using the attributes of modern life in order to describe the sitter, their work, their place, the modern furniture in Catherine's parlor, the kind of pile of stuff on a professor's desk, these things bringing the tradition of having professional attributes into a very bourgeois modern environment. Well, as many of you will remember, the exhibition of the Gross Clinic at the Centennial was a flop. It was sent to the medical pavilion. It was not accepted by the art jury because it was too scary, too frightening. And when it was shown in New York, it also polarized the critics and made quite a reputation for Aikens as a prickly and uncompromising realist. He never painted another grand portrait for 12 years. And I don't know whether the kind of trauma of the reception of the Gross Clinic put him off the topic, or whether his involvement as a teacher at the Pennsylvania Academy and the many other kinds of painting that he became interested in the late 70s and 80s just drew his attention away, because he was definitely painting many figure subjects at this time. However, some of the attitudes that I think were revealed in that portrait of him in the nude, modeling for the camera for his motion studies, got him into trouble at the Pennsylvania Academy in 1886. He was asked to resign. There was a dreadful scandal, all of it involving the use of his models, nude women models, various rumors circulating, and he left in disgrace and went through a very dark patch in the middle of the 1880s when he painted almost nothing. He did paint 3 portraits in all of 1886, and 2 of them were of professors at the University of Pennsylvania, including William Marks here on the left from 1886, who stood up for him, who backed him up at this moment when people were crossing the street in order to not pass him on the sidewalk. And that's from his own letters. Marx was the guy who helped invent a chronometer, and that's what it is on the desk next to him, a chronometer to make those motion photographs timed correctly so that the measurement of the intervals in the exposures could be scientifically quite precise. So he was one of Aiken's collaborators with those nude models. He knew what Aikens was doing. He didn't think that there was anything fishy about it, and so he was willing to pose for Aikens in this basically dark period. He was a person who was a scholar, a scientist, and he represents, like Benjamin Rand at the very beginning, a type of person that Aikens gravitated to and chose for his great portraits. He is shown here holding calipers in his hands to measure distance on these photographs, and he has a kind of classic Aikens look on his face of detachment, of thought, a person who is in reverie. This is going to be an expression that we see on so many of Aikens' sitters. The real breakout, though, from this sort of dark zone of the middle of the 1880s happened in 1889 with the commissioning of the portrait of Hayes Agnew here by his students as Dr. Agnew retired. Now, this was one of the very few commissions in Aiken's career. You can count them practically on the fingers of one hand. And one of the important points to remember in these portraits is that most of them were chosen by Aikens himself, which means that that element of response and a connection to the sitters is very powerful. These are not people that just showed up at his door and asked to be painted. Dr. Agnew, however, was a subject exactly to Aiken's taste. Another teaching doctor like Gross. Both Agnew and Gross are addressing an amphitheater of students, and that's important to the message here. He's also a very eminent surgeon and an anatomist. This gigantic canvas was a binge of portrait work that kind of dragged Aikens back into the business of making big portraits, and I think it rekindled his imagination. It certainly invigorated his self-esteem that somebody would come with an important commission like this, and so his ambition suddenly wakes up again in 1889, and he takes on again the tradition of the grand manner portrait. Lloyd Goodrich, who was Aiken's first biographer and the man who prepared the catalogue raisonné of his work, counted 250 finished portraits in Aiken's career, a career that was about 27 years. That's actually not very many pictures. Aikens was not a particularly prolific painter. He worked slowly. Well, of those 250, 10% of them are from this period up to being fired at the Pennsylvania Academy. That is, in the first 15 years of his career, 10% of the portraits. The remaining 90% are in the last 2 decades of his career. So from 1886 to the end of his career, but basically about 1909, 90% of the portraits, and that's also with those few kind of slow years in the middle of the 1880s. Really, the campaign begins in 1889 with the Agnew Clinic. Well, overall, those 250 portraits, what do they look like? Most of them are like this. They're small, sometimes very, very small, like the portrait of Susan Aikens from 1899, one of the gems of the Hirshhorn right across the mall, and the portrait of Henry O. Tanner from 1897. Most of these 250 portraits look like this. They're bust length or smaller, with the face tightly cropped, and I'd say 70% of his portraits are bust length or smaller. And the other interesting statistic in this group of 250 portraits is probably 90% of them, the figure looks away from you. The portrait of Susan Aikens is representing that 10% where the figure looks right at you. These are very rare in Aiken's work overall, and so I'm going to kind of keep track of those. Well, for starters, to compare these little ones to the grand manner pictures, it's immediately apparent that size is not at all equivalent with impact, with intensity. The small portraits are some of the most fabulous pictures that he made. So size does not necessarily correlate to the significance of the work, its importance to Aikens. However, size does correlate to expense and to time. Because if you're going to paint someone at full length, you've got to stretch a great big canvas. It's going to take you a whole lot longer. And so it's a big commitment of both materials and effort to do a larger picture. So, thinking about all of these small pictures and the few large ones, who did he decide to aggrandize? And remember, this is a self-selected group. Most of them are not going to be commissioned portraits. Well, most of them are not women. Most of the grand portraits are not women. The small ones tend to be of the women. This is Amelia Van Buren, the other sweetheart of the Washington area. This is at the Phillips Collection, a painting that always makes it worth it to go to the Phillips Collection. Amelia Van Buren from 1891. Well, what do these two pictures have in common? These are people very, very dear friends of the artist. His wife, one of his closest students and friends, and that in itself tells you something about the character of the people, the women that he painted. Only his dearest friends, his wife, was willing to be scrutinized with the kind of intensity that Akins typically laid on his sitters. The intimacy of the up-close view, especially of Susan Akins, is quite astonishing. It's very invasive. It's actually quite ruthless. It's tender, it's compassionate, but it is really a mercilessly up-close view. And most women could not take literally the physical experience of that kind of study. They weren't up to it. And of course, even most of Akins' own sitters tend to turn away, like Henry Tanner. If you think about a long posing session, and Akins was not a fast worker, it's hard to hold the gaze of your sitter with that intensity hour on hour. It's just really, really difficult. Well, let's look at somebody else engaging this same tradition. John Singer Sargent's portrait of Lady Agnew from almost exactly the same time as the portrait of Amelia Van Buren, about 1892. Well, as I suggested, it was difficult to get women to pose for Akins. He had a hard time convincing them. Partly he kept asking them to take their clothes off, and that was kind of discouraged many of them, but even others were not willing to submit to this kind of scrutiny. Sargent, of course, was paid to be flattering. Most of Sargent's sitters are not his sisters, his closest friends, his dearest relations. They are people who've come and put money down in order to be made to look good. Akins was not flattering at all. In fact, he's really rather hard on many of his women sitters. Sargent also was a much faster, more graceful painter. He painted quickly. He was just wonderfully facile, which meant that that kind of steady gaze, he could look at you and actually capture a fabulous image without hours and hours of posing. Akins was slow. The account of his sittings were often very extended, even painful. Sargent was charming. Sargent was like Gilbert Stuart, with this sort of series of anecdotes to entertain his sitters, to keep them up, to keep them laughing, to make the sitting pass pleasantly. Akins was not chatty. He was quiet. I can imagine a lot of deep breathing during his sittings. I mean, the people would have been gradually stultified by this, and so the whole environment of the studio would have been totally different. Well, I think we can get a feeling for this comparing also Lady Agnew to Letitia Wilson Jordan Bacon, one of the few of the grand portraits that Akins painted of women. This is a picture from May of 1888, one of the first pictures he painted after the debacle at the Academy, and this is the sister, the big sister of one of his students at the Art Students League. So he cajoled her into posing. After seeing her at a party where she was wearing this dress, he thought she looked beautiful, and he loved the exposure of her bones, of her chest and her upper arm in this dress, and so he begged her to come back and pose. Well, comparing the two portraits between the Sargent and the Akins, we see basically Sargent's gracefulness versus Akins' gracelessness. He sort of has taken away this stylishness of the sitter. She looks more wrinkled, she looks slightly deflated, she looks maybe like she's posed a little too long. She looks like, she reminds me of the fact that those fabulous Gibson girl hairdos that women wore in those days were hard to do. they didn't always come off. Now, Sargent would never let any of his sitters look like getting dressed was difficult, like their toilet was somehow in jeopardy. And what basically Akins has done is take away all of the conventions of flattery that are part of the Grand Manner portrait tradition. It reminds me of what Edwin Austin Abbey said when he was asked why hadn't he ever had Akins paint his portrait, and Abbey said, because he would just show everything that I've been trying to hide from everyone for all these years. And that's exactly what's going on in these portraits. Well, some of the portraits bear comparison again. They are more to Sargent again. They are more glamorous, and this is maybe the most glamorous of Akins' women's portraits. The actress Suzanne Sanchi from 1903, and I'm comparing it to Sargent's Wyndham sisters from very close on to the same date. This is an actress in a very glamorous sort of after-the-show outfit, a robe that she's wearing. But nonetheless, Suzanne looks weary. She looks like she has suffered for her art to some degree. The Wyndham sisters are very thin, they're very rich. They look like they are seated in whipped cream. They look like women who have no cares, no pain, women who live lives of effortlessness. For Akins' Grand Manner, ladies, the weariness, the effort of life is always present. Well, the second reason that there aren't very many women in Akins' Grand Manner pictures is that not that many women were picturesque enough or accomplished enough to make it into this elite group of grand pictures. That is, a group of people that Akins admired. Society girls were not interesting to Akins. He didn't paint them. Letitia Bacon was just about the only one, and certainly society girls were not begging Akins to make their portrait. And so there are very few of them because generally they weren't doctors and scholars and men of science that Akins admired. Most of the women were in the arts, like his wife, like his student, like Suzanne Sanchi, or here, like Wada Cook, basically the favorite soprano of the Art Students League in the painting The Concert Singer from 1892. I'm showing The Concert Singer opposite a portrait by Léon Bonnat, who was Akins' portrait artist teacher in Paris back in the 1860s. Bonnat was the most expensive, most prestigious portrait artist in Paris for many visiting Americans. And so dignitaries, businessmen, industrialists, and so forth would pay lots and lots of money to have Bonnat, Akins' teacher, paint their pictures, and occasionally society ladies, Madame Pasca. Bonnat was Spanish, and a lot that you see in Madame Pasca comes out of the same book that Akins was studying. That is, the darkened background, the figure emerging into light. Bonnat had looked at all those same pictures in the Prado, and the same kind of naturalism that actually was very deep now in Akins, that is, showing the careful detail of the costume and the hairstyle. However, Bonnat's Madame Pasca was criticized even in the journalism of Paris as being an effigy. This woman, you know, she was, the wits in the newspaper said that she looked like she was made of plaster, that, you know, she was so strong that you would have to, like, work at her with a pickaxe, that the dress had this kind of solidity to it. And so there is a chilliness about this picture that is altogether different from The Concert Singer. Well, Bonnat didn't know Madame Pasca. She was a paid client. Akins loved Wada Cook, and Wada Cook was patient enough to pose for hours and hours, singing over and over again, "O Rest in the Lord," from Mendelssohn's Elijah. And that music is written on the frame, just so that you know what it is that she's singing. But for his effort, you get the sense of her breathing, of her being, of her really working at singing. Let's look again at a Sargent, Mrs. Swindon, also from the same period, 1896. Sargent bringing in this wonderful breeziness, motion, elegance, and this woman with great savoir-faire. Again, a sitter he didn't know, that he painted very quickly. She came in, she did her pose, she left, and he confected this fabulous vision of her that is very direct. It's got that head-on gaze, she's looking right at you, but ultimately it's a very superficial sense of her as an individual. This is really a modern grand manner painting. This is really it as Sargent saw it, a modern Van Dyck. Status, affluence, power, that is from the good family with a lot of money. This is a very stylish update on a Van Dyck, on a Kneller. It's a likeness, but what's interesting is that he has made her into a convention. He's made her into a society lady. There is a category here that he is dropping her into. The other category that he's creating is a thing called a sergeant. He's made her into a sergeant lady, which is, of course, why the ladies were lined up at his studio, because they wanted to look like this. Well, Akins is making Way to Cook into an Akins too. And that's where I want to remind you of the fallacy of realism. She looks like she's standing there singing for you. But in Akins' choices, his choice to make her sort of stand there heavily, his choice to make that look on her face so earnest, he is adding in the sense of effort, adding weight, adding the sense of gravity to the figure, and effectively making her into a thing that is an Akins. Well, the men in Akins' grand portraits, there are 90% of the grand portraits, are a different class of characters. And I'm going to remind you of a few more statistics. I was tempted to make a pie chart, but I just didn't do it. In the grand portraits, I told you that 90% of his work was in the last 20 years and 10% at the beginning, but also these grand portraits of men and women are a very special section of his work. Out of those 250 portraits, 65 of them are half length or longer. That's 30%, are from the waist and up at life size. But only 36 are full length. You see the entire figure from head to toe, either standing or seated. Only 36, that's 15% of his total portrait output are this kind of full-length portrait. And of those, as I said, of those 36, they are way mostly men, like John McClure Hamilton here from 1895 on the right, and Hennig, the painting called The Cellist from 1896. Now, as John Wilmerding said many years ago in a wonderful article on Akins' late portraits, when you get into the portraits of men, they really start to become autobiographical. They really start to be about Akins and about his friends, his choices, the people that he admired. Both of these pictures, Akins solicited the sitter. They are not commissioned portraits. They are people that he chose to be in this very select group of full-scale portraits. So they are his friends, his colleagues, his soulmates, his heroes. What's interesting is there's not very many artists in this group. This is two of the artists here. Most of them are not artists. In this group of grand pictures, if you think about it, the artist pals, his students, like his wife and others, are the ones who will tolerate that up-close intensity. They know Akins, they know his mission, they know his project, and they'll put up with that, with him staring in their face like that for hours. The people who are the grand portraits tend to be people that he admired but that he knew a little less well, because if you think about it, you're standing farther away from the sitter. It doesn't have that kind of scrutiny in it, and so as a piece of literally of craft, of work in the studio. It is a different kind of intimacy to one of these up-close portraits, and a more detached, more dignified experience for the full-length ones. So, looking at the painters who are among this group and the artists, these are not his very best friends. Hamilton taught at the Pennsylvania Academy and was a friend of his in the city. Like Sargent, he had gone to Paris and London. He was basically the Sargent of Philadelphia in painting society pictures, and a very dedicated teacher. But there's only 3 painters who get this grand treatment. Hamilton is one, Beckwith, James Carroll Beckwith is another, and Leslie Miller, who we'll see shortly. So there aren't very many of them, and they are interestingly all portrait artists themselves and all teachers. What's interesting, though, if they're not going to be teachers, if they're not going to be artists and painters, then who is in this group of the grand pictures? Well, there's a special category of people who were inherently picturesque and wonderful, just fabulous as subjects to paint. One of them, Frank Hamilton Cushing, with his wonderful Priest of the Bow outfit from his Zuni ethnography, and the imposing Mrs. Frischmuth on the right, a great collector of musical instruments. He loved the paraphernalia, and in both of these pictures you can see him coming very close to a modern version of a Grand Manner portrait, in letting the material of that person's world express something about their identity. The next to the largest group of the grand portraits are all of Catholic priests and Jesuit clerics, 6 of them, 6 full-length portraits beginning in 1900, out of a total of 13 portraits that he did of Catholic scholars, teachers, and church leaders. He liked their company, he said. He said they told good stories, that they were very human, that they were intelligent, but not too otherworldly. And looking at their faces and knowing that Akins used to bicycle out to Villanova to have supper with these guys, to tell stories, to interact with them, you can see that some of the things that he liked about them were things that he felt might have been true about himself as well. They also had this wonderful picturesque costume, and I think that part of the appeal of the priests was their berettas, their cassocks, their lace, and so forth. And that made them a kind of a combination of scholars and of picturesqueness, such as we saw with Cushing and Frischmuth. It's also interesting when you see these two together, Archbishop Elder on the left and Sebastian Cardinal Martinelli on the right, both of them from right after the turn of the century, of the problem of the full-length portrait. How many ways can you do it? You can stand, you can sit, you can lie on the ground. If you're going to have a seated sitter, how many ways can you turn the chair to create interesting variations on this theme? With Martinelli, it's so interesting how he turned, and we have the plans for this picture, he turned the chair 18 degrees off the central axis, just enough so that his face remains in profile like a Renaissance portrait, but you can see both of his hands with his cardinal ring. He's on his way to Rome. He's the first new appointee to Rome, and the ring is very important. So these little adjustments, you can think of Akins playing with his choices and making, in fact, a world of variation out of these conventions. The clerics share a quality with the other big group, which is, I'm going to call them men at desks. Scholars, scientists, people like Dr. Rand, we've seen Dr. Marks, and here is Mr. Brinton, Dr. Brinton, he's in your halls from 1875 on the left, and Henry Rowland, the great physicist of Johns Hopkins from 1897 on the right. Dr. Brinton was a surgeon, and this we've seen many surgeons already. Dr. Rowland was a physicist, described as the most brilliant man of science of his era. He's holding a diffraction grating in his hand, and like many of these pictures, we've seen people with their machines, the things that express their identity. And Akins has been very, very careful about depicting not only the spectrum in his hand, but the diffraction grating itself, the machine that's on the table behind him that measures the spectrum of light. This is another picture with a frame that has information on it that tells you about the sitter, the formulas, the rulings, basically that Akins made up in order to add a kind of aura of science to the image of Dr. Rowland, of Professor Rowland. Well, what's so interesting about the Rowland portrait is that Akins chased him to paint him. He never met him. He didn't know him. He wrote him a letter in Maine and said, "I admire you so much, I want to come and paint your portrait." And Rowland said, "That's fine." Akins went up there, stayed there for a week or so, painted this picture, and actually carried back with him the machine so that he could study it carefully and put it correctly in the painting. Akins said in his letters home from Maine that he loved watching Brinton think and work things out. He just liked sitting there, watching him playing with his machines, thinking over problems. And when Akins came back to finish the portrait, he tried to convey that quality of thought, including both his expression and the attributes of his identity that are in his tools. There is an homage to Rowland in this picture, in the very faithful depiction of the sitter and his machine. That is Akins tapping his own skill, his own excellence, as a direct tribute to the sitter. It is a statement of equivalence, of peerage, that I am to my business as you are to yours. And he actually said to Dr. DaCosta, when they were arguing about a portrait, one of the few commissions, he said, "I presume my position in art is not second to your own in medicine." So a picture like this is Akins being as good as he can be in his business to express the excellence of Rowland in his. It is a kind of handshake between professions and a very profound statement of Akins' own sense of pride and accomplishment in bonding with these people that he so admired. Among the greatest of the grand portraits that are basically ungrand in so many interesting ways is the portrait of Lewis Kenton from 1900 on the left. It is the most interesting of these grand portraits because it has been totally stripped down, especially by comparison to the Rowland, which has the frame, it has all the tools, it has the assistant in the background, all this kind of paraphernalia to tell you about who Rowland was. Kenton has nothing of that. It's completely empty of that sort of attribute, and it is also very ostentatiously quoting from the grand portrait tradition. This is Velázquez on the right-hand side, his portrait of the jester, Pablo de Valladolid, that he probably saw in Madrid many decades earlier. Akins is very deliberately quoting from Velázquez. And in that quotation, which he wants you to get, it makes the Akins-ishness of it stick out more. You can see Velázquez and you can also see the Akins here very clearly. Well, what's Spanish? That glowing background, the very strong and lively contour of the figure, the flatness of the black forms of the body, hit by these bright, very three-dimensional spots of the hands, of the face, of the cuffs. Those are both completely consistent between the two. So what is ungrand about this? How has Akins basically subverted the tradition of court painting in the 17th century to make it very modern? Well, for starters, who is the sitter? Lewis Kenton. Nobody you've ever heard of, nobody famous at all. He's Aiken's brother-in-law. He married Susan Aiken's sister in 1899. Almost nothing is known about him. He was a bookkeeper, a clerk, from a family of shoemakers. There's really very little clues about him. But he's shown here, gigantic, in format, like a nobleman, although he is flagrantly not aristocratic, not rich, not famous, not very elegant even. This is a very confusing combination of the conventions of the portrait and the reality of the sitter. It's confusing in exactly the same way that Courbet's great burial at Ornans was confusing. Ordinary people made monumental. Well, in fact, the only thing we have to choose to figure out who Kenton is his suit and his informal pose with his hands in his pockets. His suit doesn't fit very well. It's a cheap suit. It doesn't fit him the way sergeants' clothes fit sergeant sitters. It looks like it was bought off the rack. And in fact, critics of the day when this picture was shown, criticized the ugliness of this man and his pose. It was really very modern in its middle class, lower middle class lack of elegance. Well, what else is happening in this picture? We have the depiction of thought with an away gaze. That is, Kenton retreats away from us into reverie, into thinking. His only accomplishment in this picture is that he is thinking. It is his only activity. And I compare it to another portrait by Bonnat, his teacher in Paris. This is of William T. Walters, famous to you from Baltimore. Again, a financier who had his portrait painted in Paris. And this portrait is very emblematic of the French naturalism that Bonnat espoused, borrowing very heavily from Spain. That is, that brilliant light from the side, the directness of the pose, the kind of really unflattering treatment of the sitter, a kind of no-nonsense businessman that we feel in this, again, engaged head-on, but nonetheless presented to us, like Madame Pasca, as almost an effigy, as a facade. Back to Kenton and his thinking. The title, The Thinker, which is the way the picture is often known, comes to us from Susan Aikens. She titled it The Thinker after Aiken's death. It was always exhibited in his lifetime as the portrait of Lewis Kenton. Mrs. Aikens had her reasons for changing the title of this picture. She did not like Lewis Kenton. He had not been good to her sister. And the title is almost, in fact, a kind of a joke. Elizabeth Johns told me that she learned from Seymour Edelman. This is a long Aikens-ish shaggy dog story, but Elizabeth Johns said that Seymour Edelman asked Mrs. Aikens about the title of this, The Thinker, and Susan Aikens laughed and said, "Oh, he was no thinker." Here's a photograph that we think is of Kenton that turned up in the Bregler collection. Knowing what Susan Aikens said, and knowing that she was the person who gave it the title of The Thinker, we can see here perfectly a display of the way both the realism of Aikens and the photograph can each be in their way manipulated. This is a very contrived photograph with Kenton studiously reading a book, looking like a scholar in any event, even though Mrs. Aikens asserted that he was no thinker. So what we find is that both the photographer and the painter here have conspired to do something different with Lewis Kenton in order to tell a story. Aikens is basically making Kenton into an Aikens, that is, projecting his vision of a modern existential man, that is, the act of thinking being what makes him human and his only attribute, taking that vision of modern man and his existential dilemma and imposing it on a Velázquez conventional grand manner portrait. It is a classic Aikens ungrand manner picture, turning the conventions upside down to express his own sense of the modern condition. Well, a portrait of Aikens is emerging from his choices. The types of people that he admired, the way they're depicted, and how he has taken the grand manner conventions and reshaped them to his own values. It's certainly true from that statement he made to Da Costa that he saw himself as a modern-day Velázquez. No question. He is playing in the same grand game, trying to take his place in the tradition of art history, building from the Baroque through the new naturalism of the French Academy, adding modern subject matter, and then his own personal interest in absorption and in thought. In 1882, he was characterized, that is 20 years before this portrait, he was characterized as America's master of portrayal of mere thinking without the aid of gesture or attitude. So early in his career, he was spotted as a person who was interested in this inwardness. And even when he was in Paris, he wrote home and said that the kind of person he admired was, and I quote, the higher class, the thinking and feeling ones who always want to see everything and know more. Well, of course, he's talking about himself. This is the kind of person that he wishes to be, the kind of person that he thinks of himself as. Well, let's think, too, about the looking at us in one last example. Most of the grand portraits seem to be about thinking. A very, very few of them are looking at us. The exception is Leslie Miller, another one of his painters, from 1901. This is Leslie Miller on the left and James Holland, the Dean's Roll Call in 1899. Well, again, why so few of these people looking at you? I mentioned how it's hard to maintain. I mentioned how it must make the sitter feel self-conscious, maybe even embarrassed. So you protect the privacy of the sitter if you allow them to look away. And it, of course, makes the sitter more passive and gives the artist much more power because you are working while they are effectively not looking at you. Andrew Wyeth doesn't like to have his sitters look at him because he says he likes to be alone when he's painting. He likes to feel invisible. And it's so much more comfortable to be a kind of voyeur of the way that both Akins and Wyeth are, to have your sitter look away, and then you can just bear down on them like a laser. And that quality of looking and that need to be invisible, to be a voyeur, I think are very key to why so many of Akins' sitters look away. And because in that looking away, the artist is then, it gives the Akins the power to impose on you, to work on you, as well as to study you. These two pictures bracket the thinker. The Miller portrait of 1901 and the James Holland portrait of 1899, and they are linked by the themes of intellectual life of the Academy of Teaching, themes we've seen again and again. Holland was the dean of Jefferson Medical College. Miller was the principal of the Pennsylvania School of Industrial Arts. Both of them have invisible students present. They are addressing an audience of students, and I think that that is a powerful part of these late group of thinkers and teachers. They also have the same quotations from the great tradition. Look at the way the cuffs jump, the way the figure flattens out. But also, what do all of these grand pictures have in common? Well, I told you, so many of them are men, they're all middle class, they're all very well educated professional people, and most important of all, almost all of them, 75% of the full-length grand pictures, are teachers. They're deans, they're principals, they're professors. It's a group that so dominates the series that we have to ask ourselves, why? What's going on? Well, for Miller, his standing pose suggests teaching. It suggests the same phenomenon that we saw with Dr. Gross and Dr. Agnew of the amphitheater with students present. The pose also suggests Akins' own dress and posture. Akins himself famously informal, and Miller later affectionately remembered that Akins made him drag out this old jacket that he used to ride his bicycle in to wear. And he said, I never would have been wearing a jacket like that to talk to the students. But Akins, this is where Akins is making an Akins. He's hoping, he's asking Miller to actually be more rumpled, less grand, more informal than he might have preferred to be if he had, in fact, been driving this commission. So that is ungrand in its own special way. It's a deceit in the direction of informality in the same way that Sargent's deceits drive in the direction of flattery. Akins is going in exactly the opposite direction. It also tells us about, and here's one more picture that you saw before of Akins again to remind you of how Miller starts to feel like Akins. It's also all about teaching. And subliminally, there is a presence of teaching here that's very important to Akins. Akins' father was a teacher, a writing master. Akins, the first job he applied for was as a teacher. We are all so glad that he didn't get that job as drawing teacher at Central High School, but it was how he started out. And he taught steadily at various schools, fired once at the Academy in '86, fired twice at Drexel in 1896, and finally abandoning teaching in 1897, just 3 years before this portrait. But there is still, I think, a yearning in Akins to stand in front of students. So many of his pictures are about teaching and about his admiration for those people who taught. And so thinking of Miller as his alter ego, he was very close in age, came to Philadelphia to run the School of Industrial Arts at the time that Akins was running the Academy, so they were like competitors across town. Miller actually wrote some kind of nasty reviews of Akins' work in the 1880s as an art critic. But by the time of this portrait, they are now both comrades, that is, of the old guard, and the tables have completely turned because Miller is now the principal in charge of the students, and Akins is basically without his student cohort and living in obscurity, such that the students in Miller's class did not know who Akins was when he came to do this portrait. Miller is active. He is the active intelligence, as Carol Troyan pointed out, that is a foil to the passive thinking of Kenton. He leans to the left here, and very much like a pattern of the Velázquez, bringing all of the lights in his body to one side. He's in a studio, very much like Akins' portrait, and he is basically addressing his students, meeting us eye to eye. So who are we? We are maybe Miller's students listening to his announcements, or perhaps Miller is in Akins' shoes, where he used to be. That is, he has taken Akins' place, and Akins sees him as a surrogate, or perhaps in a more psychological way, we are looking in a mirror, eye to eye, at Akins himself. If we look at the details of these pictures, we feel that quality of identity. And indeed, this is the only full-length grand portrait where the sitter's eyes meet ours. It is, in fact, the person who is the most like Akins and who Akins, I think, deeply respected and even envied by this time in his life. So now, think again about the self-portrait that we began the lecture with from 1902. It's his National Academy of Design election portrait that all artists were asked to submit when they were elected to this august body. Well, it's 25 years too late. He should have been elected to the National Academy of Design in 1875. And so something in the look in his face is addressing himself to the other members of the National Academy of Design, saying, so here I am at last in 1902. That bitterness, that sadness perhaps, that reproach, that we can sense in it. Now you can feel a deeper story in layering him with Miller. Certainly, in comparison to Miller, his face is much more open, much more vulnerable. Miller seems, by comparison, more composed, more detached from us. But the comparison of these two pictures, I think, gives us a wonderful way to revisit the sense of knowing that we get from the self-portrait. Well, I'm going to leave you with the picture that I mentioned at the beginning. The Thompson portrait that's just been promised to the National Gallery by John Wilmerding, which is on the left-hand screen. And Thompson #2, the second version of this picture, very puzzling pairing of portraits and very unusual in Aiken's career. These are Aiken's last finished full-length portraits, 1906, and then the finished version in 1907. Well, big surprise, this is another doctor, another teacher, another thinker, the last of the men at desks with their books and their tools. This man also taught at Jefferson. He was like Dr. Gross. He was like Dr. Brinton. He was, however, an expert in the theory and practice of ophthalmology, and so he holds in his hand an ophthalmoscope, and on the back wall is a Snellen chart, one of those A, B, C things where the letters get big and small, because these are the tools of his trade. So this is exactly like the Roland portrait, like the chronometer in the Marx portrait, like the microscope in Dr. Rand's. These are the tools that tell you about his identity in exactly the way of a Renaissance or a Baroque portrait. Both men, both Aikens and Thompson, were aging now, and both of them had many common interests: optics, photography. It is wonderful to think about the conversation that these two gentlemen had in the studio in Aiken's house. It shows Aiken's very typical, delicate asymmetry with the lights against the darks, his usual fine observation of skin, of textiles, of the machines. And it is the last and very gentle face-to-face encounter that we will find in the grand portraits. A man who seems wise, fragile, alert, weary, but a little twinkling, especially in the portrait that's here. Sylvan Schindler described this portrait, the face, as the face of an examining physician, with this kind of interest and compassion. And it was Nancy Anderson's great discovery to find that indeed Dr. Thompson was Aiken's personal eye doctor, and he had known him for at least 15 years when this portrait was made. So this is a gentleman that I think you like to tell your troubles to. I encourage you all to go up and visit him in the gallery. Think about how his gaze meets you, and think about the conversation that passed with the gentleman who was first looking at him face to face.
We would have time for a few questions, if there are any from the audience. I think that's Joyce over there.
Joyce.
You speak.
A number of the paintings you showed had portraits behind them on the wall. Have you been looking at whether the paintings on the wall are about the sitter or about the artist?
The one good example that she asked about the portraits in the background. The one good example that I immediately remember is the Brinton portrait, which is in the galleries here. In the Brinton portrait, I have not been able to identify that portrait. It looks like a Sully. It has all the qualities of a Sully. Brinton was from an old Philadelphia family, and that room is full of furniture that he actually borrowed and hauled over to his studio to sort of set up a fake parlor in his studio. So I think there really was a portrait there that said something about Brinton's family. There's a fire bucket under the desk that says Brinton. I think it's very particular to Brinton. So that makes me, I actually went to the Sully Register to see if there were any Brintons, and there were none of the right era to have been that particular portrait. So maybe it was his mother's family. But in any event, I'm quite sure it was a family portrait and that there's some meaning there, but I've never been able to identify it. What was the other one? I don't know it. I don't know. He's so dodgy. that it gives you a sense of it being, I mean, one of the things about the Brinton portrait that's so interesting is that you have a feeling of being in Brinton's parlor. But when you look at his drawings, you realize it's a totally invented space. And so there were real artifacts there, but there was also fudging going on. So it's hard to know whether you'll ever be able to identify them exactly. Portraits inside portraits.
Seth.
Well, I think you're quite right to analyze the portraits of male students in terms of rivalry self-identification with the academic or the technical classes, and that this goes a long way towards explaining the seeming objectivity of these portraits. In fact, the page is so very neat, but it seems like there's a real fundamental gender and division on gender lines in these portraits, and that rather than account for the difference in terms of Aiden's greater familiarity with some of the female series, if it doesn't seem as though he's actually recording kind of scandalous associations of his intimacy is practically most pointedly with these kind of these vulnerable looking, rather enervated women in their slightly ball gowns, this kind of disarray, and that this then, I mean, that in fact this is the seeming intimacy rather than account for it along in terms of the informality, the natural of the woods, actually reflects this kind of artifice that we're trying to get at, talking about.
Well, I do think there's a very strong gender divide. I definitely do. I think it has to do, however, with really the life ways of women in this period, so that they were, either they were artists in his own small circle, but there just weren't any surgeons and physicists and so forth for him to treat in that way. So I mean, I showed you all of the women's, all the grand women. I didn't show you all of the grand men, but Mrs. Frischmuth and Letitia Bacon, the concert singer, that's it. So then you just have to look at those more intimate portraits of his wife and his students and his sisters and the wives of his friends and so forth that are in the smaller format to get a better run of his attitude toward women. But I honestly think that the women having less powerful professional identity are more likely to be manipulated, and I don't know whether that's what you were suggesting as well, because they are more passive, they are more like a blank canvas that he can play with, and so the sense that they are all on the verge of tears, which John Wilmerding has noted. Susan Akins herself, there's a very famous small picture of Susan Akins, the lady with the setter dog, that is quarter size, so that it's the reverse of a grand portrait. But she looks so sad and so depressed in that picture, and many people have made much of her dejection in that painting. Or the picture at the Hirshhorn. Other people who knew Susan Akins said that she was a prankster, a practical jokester, a very funny person, and very lively. And so to know that the way Akins has chosen to depict her is to only pull the thoughtful and depressive side out of her, it would seem to me that it's telling you as much about Akins as it's telling you about Susan, which I think is just a recap of my thesis here.
Yes.
I had not thought about Akins and Velázquez in late Akins paintings, and your selection, your showing of the Kenton and the Miller and the Holland portrait are so extraordinarily Velázquez influenced, and there was so much of an interest in Velázquez in this country around 1900, mid-1890s to 1904, an exhibition in Boston. But to the subject, but he stripped down the use of color and it's tonal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it's wonderful, wonderful to see.
That point was, I think, superbly made 2 years ago in the Manet Velázquez exhibition, which gathered many of these pictures, and from his contemporaries as well, other American painters who were in this same mode. To gather them in was truly breathtaking to see how powerful that formal story was that you've described. And I do think he wants you to get it.
Maybe one last question from Ellen here.
Well, what you're getting are comments and not questions, which is actually great because it shows how provocative the comments are and interesting. What I think is going on in an interesting way is a subversion of the Grand Manner tradition, because in the Grand Manner tradition it's not only the size of the painting, but the emphasis on the face and on the person. And the second to that would be everything around the person. Stuart said, Fry at the English schools, the drapery to bring out the flesh, and Bacon has done exactly the opposite. So I think that not only is it a subversion because they're not commissioned, but also because he's doing exactly what he wants to do.
Yes.
Yes. Maybe we
Thank you, Ellen. You who know better.
take our questions outside and meet for a small reception. Thank you so much, Ken.
Good.